After months of campaigning and tens of millions of dollars spent on attack ads,
who's to blame? Patty Murray.
the midterm elections are finally over.
Tiffany Smiley, the wrong choice for Washington.
From the balance of power in Congress to a battle to lead the Washington Secretary of State's office, much was at stake on November 8th.
Democracy is too important to disenfranchise people.
I'm definitely an underdog.
Seattle voters also picked the next King County prosecutor and voiced on whether to change future city elections. What political strategies worked and what didn't in 2022?
Republican Party really paid a price for their sort of wacky candidates.
Our veteran journalists weigh in.
Democrats have overreached when it comes to reform, criminal legal system reforms.
Recapping the results of the midterm elections, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Amidst the flood of national news about the midterm elections, voters in our state have some high-stakes local races they're watching closely too. From a fight over political identity in the Secretary of State's race to several political newcomers running for state legislature, we'll have a full slate of new leaders in Olympia. Plus, there's a new King County prosecutor for the first time in 15 years. A countywide land conservation tax levy, and a Seattle measure that may change the future of our citywide elections. This week, we're reviewing the early election results on the races that affect you the most.
Tiffany Smiley, the wrong choice for Washington. Who's to blame? Patty Murray.
In a bruising race for U.S. Senate, the most expensive in Washington state history, incumbent Democrat Patty Murray and her opponent Tiffany Smiley both painted each other as party extremists. The race was called for Murray after election night returns, but Smiley said it was too early to concede.
Good evening, everyone.
It was a similar partisan fight in our state's 8th congressional district.
We don't need another 2 years of the same direction.
He aligns with some of the most extreme members of Congress.
Incumbent Democrat Kim Schreier is leading Republican challenger Matt Larkin 53 to 47% in early returns.
I've worked in a bipartisan manner. I've worked across the aisle.
Politics is a polarizing distraction for the Secretary of State.
In the Washington Secretary of State race, Democrat Steve Hobbs, appointed last year, leads his nonpartisan opponent, Julie Anderson, in his quest for 2 more years on the job. But it's a tight 50 to 47% margin after election night. In the state legislature, it's a changing of the guard for many Seattle area seats, with first-time candidates, all Democrats, facing off against each other in the House. In the 34th, Emily Alvarado is leading Leah Griffin 69 to 30%. In the 37th, Chapalo Street is beating Amijah Smith 54 to 44%. And in the 46th, Daria Farivar is winning 56 to 43% over Dr. Lilach Rave. Democrats control the state Senate, 28 seats to 21, and the state House, 57 to 41. And early results show they'll add seats to those majorities, as they've been able to do since 2016. For King County prosecutor, voters are selecting Lisa Mannion, the incumbent's current chief of staff, over Federal Way Mayor Jim Farrell, 55 to 44%, according to election night numbers.
It's important that every vote get counted.
Mannion says her platform of prosecuting violent crime and using restorative justice programs resonated with county voters.
It was my deep level of experience. It's the balanced approach.
King County's Proposition 1, the Conservation Futures Tax, or CFT levy, is passing by a wide 68 to 32% margin in early returns.
I'm all for open space, but enough is enough.
Despite concerns from some taxpayers, the CFT faced no organized opposition, and the average property owner will now pay about $30 more per year for land preservation in King County.
It's a matter of sort of pay a little bit now or pay a lot more later.
Seattle's Proposition 1 posed a fundamental question. Is it time to change the way we vote?
The thing about Prop 1A is it delivers the most representative voting system we can have.
Early results show a no vote, 51 to 49%, to Prop 1's main question, asking if our voting system should be changed. But if the measure does pass, voters chose option 1B over 1A on election night, meaning future citywide elections would use a ranked choice system rather than an approval voting system as early as 2027.
I'm really excited that we can have better elections in a really simple and effective way.
From preserving the status quo in our state's congressional delegation, to a changing of the guard in Olympia, to setting the tone for prosecuting crime in King County, it's time to assess some major themes from the 2022 midterms after a hard-fought battle to Election Day.
And we're joined by an esteemed group of journalists to break down some of these issues. I will start with Naomi Ishisaka. She's a columnist for the Seattle Times, the assistant managing editor for diversity, inclusion, and staff development. Naomi, great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And we also have Will Casey. He's the law and justice reporter for The Stranger. Will, good to have you too.
Thanks for having me.
All righty, let's jump right into it. And to start with, we're looking at some very, very early numbers here. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on that. But I think it is safe to say that the red wave a lot of people were talking about didn't really materialize here in the midterms, certainly not nationwide and definitely not in Washington state. So Naomi, I want to start with this race for U.S. Senate between the incumbent Democrat Patty Murray, the Republican challenger Tiffany Smiley. Murray won it. Race was called on election night, though Smiley was telling her supporters it ain't over. Were you surprised by this result?
You know, I was a little surprised. And first, I just want to say the biggest winner of all this is, of course, the viewers who don't have to watch these incessant ads
well played.
that
Yes.
have been going for seemingly nonstop 24/7 for the past few months.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was surprised. I think, you know, because I've seen incessant ads and because, you know, things did not seem like they were going to be as close as they were, I do think that some of the conventional wisdom was a little bit overblown, that some of the vulnerabilities that they thought were going to be, you know, weighing down on Murray didn't really materialize in the way that they expected.
Yeah, it could be one of the longest serving senators we've ever had coming up here. Will, some thoughts on this race, also the most expensive U.S. Senate race in our state history here. Smiley was even outgaining Murray in fundraising down the stretch here, but it wasn't enough. Some reactions to this result here.
Well, I think it's just an indication of how tough it's going to be for Republicans to win statewide at all, unless they significantly sort of rebrand and try to tack, you know, back to the middle. And they've just, as JT Wilcox will tell you, had a hard time enforcing sort of party discipline up and down the ballot. So I think, you know, so long as they're getting clobbered in King County, where there's a large portion of the state
voters
population,
here,
and frankly voters who show up, right? And I think that's going to be a challenge for them going forward.
Okay, and it seemed like a similar story playing out in the 8th Congressional District. Hasn't been called yet, but Democrat Kim Schreier up 6 points on Matt Larkin according to the election night numbers. Will, maybe I'll start with you here. National elections experts were calling this a toss-up kind of a district. Any surprises on this one specifically?
I don't think so, mostly because Schreier's done a really good job of highlighting her independent record of delivering for the district, right? I mean, you've seen a lot of her advertising was focused on, specific accomplishments she's done to help build infrastructure over the, east side of the mountains, and really sort of touting her, sort of bipartisan bona fides.
She had some bills that Trump supported and Biden supported. I remember that part too.
Right, exactly. And so I think that sort of willing to buck the party label thing helps with those more centrist voters in central Washington, and then Eastern King County these days just deep blue. So.
It's an interesting district there for sure. Naomi, some thoughts about this. I know the Times and the Stranger both endorsed Kim Schreier and Patty Murray for that matter, and that dual endorsement doesn't always happen between the two papers, but it was a full moon last night, so I'll just chalk it up to that. Why do you think Republicans could not flip this district? Any thoughts there?
Well, and I think, I think my colleague Danny Westney talked about this a little bit in his column. I think there was a little bit of a perhaps lack of respect for the need to have winnable arguments that reach the middle. And I think one of the things that Kim Schreier did, to like Will's saying, is she really expressed how she was serving all the people in her district, whereas I think Matt Larkin ran on more of a, diehard right approach that didn't really translate well, I think, to the moderate voters.
Yeah, just kind of doubled down on that. And I was thinking, too, about the 3rd Congressional District, too, down around Vancouver there. Will, any thoughts on this one? Joe Kent, I know, is a big-time Trump-backed candidate, et cetera, and it looks like for the first time in a while, Clark County is going to flip blue. That's a big deal down there.
That is a big deal, and I mean, cards on the table. I worked for the first challenger, to Jamie Herr Butler back in 2018, Carolyn Long, and so it's been a multi-year, organizing effort down there, and I think that they're really starting to see some of the, fruits of the labor of running competitive candidates cycle after cycle. You build on that success, and Marie didn't need to, start from scratch, which I think is, really important when you're trying to, flip that kind of a reach district.
She seemed like a relative unknown down there. Your thoughts about that? A lot of money got poured into that district, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think she had a profile, even though she was a first-time candidate, that really sort of resonated with the district, right? Small business owner, built her own home. I think those kind of like apolitical, but like relatable sort of characteristics really served her well. And also, she was very compromising about reaching across to Jamie Herrera Butler supporters who might have felt disappointed by the primary.
Right. Important piece there. I'm going to try to put this in perspective, if I can, on a national level. And Naomi, I'll start with you here. Republicans could still take the House by a slim majority there. Republicans also had some big wins. I'm thinking about Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, even flipped a few traditionally Democrat districts there to get that victory. So without a clear election night victory, let's say, for either party here, how do we come out of this election as a country? Are we less divided than when we entered into it? Do you have any thoughts about that? Because it seems a little undecided. I saw undecided on so many different headlines today after Election Day, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was struck by some of the exit polling yesterday that showed that there was actually a lot of discontent around Democratic policies. There was discontent with Biden, and yet people still, supported the Democrats in all different kinds of races. And I think what that tells us is that they might have their concerns and they might have their reservations, but at the end of the day, they're worried about abortion rights. They're worried
I was going to say those issues.
Yeah, they're worried about things that affect them on the day-to-day, whether or not, less on sort of the very, very shrill attacks that we've seen mostly on these, ad campaigns, but they're also just want to see that they have bodily autonomy, have health care, have the things that matter in their day-to-day life. And to me, that's the uniting factor that you're seeing across the board.
Got it. Will, maybe I can go to you on this one. It was a great line on the New York Times, more of a red ripple than a red wave on election night there. But looking at that national picture, are we less divided? Are there some themes that you can associate with voters here after Election Day?
Well, I think you saw the president try to make a closing argument, the week leading into Election Day that, just enough of us on just enough occasions have, come together to decide that we want to continue to be a democracy. And I think that's basically what you saw, There's still a very loud, not as small of a minority as we'd like it to be probably, who don't seem to be that concerned with the, continuity of democratic, institutions in this country, but enough of the folks did show up. And I think that that's really what you saw, across the various swing districts, although gerrymandering means, we have far fewer competitive House races than we did even 2 years ago. So.
Right. And is it a situation, Naomi was bringing up issues like reproductive rights. Was there an issue that you think really brought voters out? I know a lot of people are concerned about the economy, inflation at a 40-year high here. Anything like that drew people out in your mind?
I think more than any of those individual issues, what you saw was people being truly unsettled by how far out of the mainstream like most of the Republican candidates have gone. And I think that you saw that in, for example, Pennsylvania's Senate race, right? I think if Dr. Oz wasn't a, fraudster on TV and was instead just sort of a normal, maybe a state legislator seeking a promotion or something, that might have been a more competitive race. But I think the Republican Party really paid a price for their sort of wacky candidates that they recruited this cycle.
We will see what happens in Georgia, though. Yeah, keep going.
I think there's also something that happened in terms of, I think Republicans really tried to press this idea that Democrats were soft on crime and that, the cities were kind of on fire and it was apocalyptic hellscape. And that didn't seem to gain a lot of traction with voters. And I think that, that barrage of advertising, it didn't really show up in the polls in the way that I think they thought it would. And I think that cost them.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this partisan idea here, back to some local races here. A very interesting partisan versus nonpartisan battle for the Secretary of State race in our state. Steve Hobbs, appointed to the job last year. He's a Democrat. Julie Anderson, Pierce County Auditor, ran as a nonpartisan. A close one on election night. Hobbs leading 50 to 47%. But Will, you wrote about this race a couple weeks ago, and I thought this was fascinating. Polls then at the time were showing that Republican voters might write in State Representative Brad Klippert from the 8th District down in Kennewick. So the GOP didn't win this race necessarily, but the fact that 3.1% of the voters, at least on election night, supported a write-in candidate, they might have given this to the Democrats, it looks like.
Yeah, and I think that that's interesting because when I was writing that piece, we were drawing on the sort of example of the 2020 lieutenant governor's race, right? And that's where you had Joshua Freed running as a write-in candidate, and he really mounted like a full-scale campaign. I think what you didn't see as much this cycle was Clipper didn't seem to have as much infrastructure, and whether or not the state Republican Party decided to do a big organizing push for him, maybe it was too late of a decision, who knows. But as you said, it does seem like he might have pulled the race just enough away from Anderson to give Hobbs the victory.
That's going to be so interesting to see how that plays out. I know there's still ways to go in terms of counting votes. Naomi, back to you on this one. The Times editorial board endorsed Steve Hobbs, but has also supported this proposal from Julie Anderson to remove the party label from electing a Secretary of State, which I thought was very interesting. What's your takeaway from this partisan, nonpartisan race for Secretary of State? That was a big issue in this.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that part of it, but I do think that people are at a, obviously a huge amount of sensitivity around election security and partisanship and electioneering. And I think if there's ways to bring more trust into the process, I think that's a good thing.
And first person of color to be elected to this position too, and Steve Hobbs, I think that might have some resonance too. It was certainly something that he campaigned on in terms of reaching out to people, et cetera. Did you have any feel for that, how that impacted his campaign?
I don't know, not too much. I mostly know him from before this race, and he was a little bit more conservative on the conservative side. So I didn't see that
a radical moderate, I think he called himself.
I didn't see that playing out as much with people I know, in terms of thinking about it in that way. But maybe it did persuade some people.
Interesting pieces in all these races here. So, Will, I'm going to go back to you and talk about our state legislature. So, if the results from election night hold true, Dems could pick up a seat in the Senate and 3 additional House seats. They already have a majority in both. So, no red wave, definitely sticking with that theme. But I'm wondering what the bigger takeaway is on the state level. Will we see a push now in Olympia next session for Democrats looking for a state constitutional amendment for abortion rights or stronger gun laws, or any thoughts about what stronger Democratic majorities in the state House and Senate could mean?
Well, I think they fell just a couple seats short of being able to reach the majorities they would need to amend the Constitution for abortion rights, because at this point our reporting shows like not a single Republican is willing to cross party lines and support that. However, I think you are going to see sort of a argument that centrists within the party in Olympia have been using for the last couple of sessions really kind of lose a lot of traction, which is basically they need to be careful about how aggressive they push on things like affordable housing or progressive taxation, because the suburban voters might have a backlash if they go too far. But I think what we've seen 3 cycles in a row now is that the Republican Party just isn't competitive in a significant way, and really the only check on whether or not voters are going to be happy with the Democrats are going to come from within the party itself. Yeah, they've been building on those majorities since 2016. It's important to point that out. Naomi, I wanted to make sure I looked here in the Seattle area specifically, a lot of new faces, political newcomers actually to the 34th, 37th, and 46th districts. Any expectations there from what we would see from that Seattle delegation when it comes to what's next in Olympia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see what's next on that front. I think, both in the 37th, where I'm from, and the 34th, if I'm remembering the districts right, that's the one with Daria.
She's 46.
46, yeah.
Yep.
That one, I think, is really interesting, too, because she brings the diversity rights perspective to it. And I think that's such an important aspect to bring into the legislature, to have that sort of thinking about how do our policies and our politics affect people with disabilities. I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, and I think if we can have a wider conversation about that, that's a beautiful thing. And then in the 37th, I think we've always had a very strong progressive for as long as I can remember. People of color in leadership in
Pramila Jayapal not too many years ago.
Sharon Tomiko Santos. I think there's a long history of that in the South End, and I think that a lot of the progressive legislation that happens really gets pushed from the south end of Seattle, and so I think we're going to see that continuing.
That is going to be interesting, especially when it comes to police accountability, which I know has taken a bit of a roller coaster ride over the past couple of years in Olympia. So I'll be very closely looking at what those legislators do. But I want to jump down to the King County level and the vote for prosecutor here. Very interesting here. Dan Satterberg stepping down after 15 years on the job. His chief of staff, Lisa Mannion, held a 55 to 44% lead over federal Way Mayor Jim Farrell on election night. Naomi, I'll start with you here. Times endorsed Farrell, but he also had the endorsement of several police unions. It looks like he's getting pushed back here. What do you make of this result? I thought it was very surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think that this idea that Democrats have overreached when it comes to reform, criminal legal system reforms, I think we're seeing sort of a, kind of a backlash to that narrative, right? I think we're seeing that people aren't as unwilling to try new approaches. I think we're seeing in this Mannion race that some of the things that she's advocating for, such as looking at how do we make public safety. Think about public safety more broadly rather than jails and cops, but how do we create all the conditions so that we don't have crime in the first place? I think we're seeing a lot more receptivity to that approach than we might have thought before this election.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Law and Justice reporter, let's talk to you about this. It really did seem like Jim Farrell was trying to outlaw injustice. Lisa Mannion here saying he'd be tougher on crime, etc. And I'm really thinking about how Seattle voters have said yes to that message a little bit over the last couple of years here, haven't supported candidates seen as more progressive. I'm kind of thinking of this broadly here. With all that in mind, were you surprised at this election result?
No, simply because we're in an even year electorate, right? I think that like what you see, just looking at the traffic on our endorsements page, for example, compared to last year, it's not just, it was several orders of magnitude larger than we saw in the 2021 race. And I think that's just because you have more younger people, you have people who move more frequently that don't necessarily tune into politics as a sort of hobby of theirs, but when you have the national sort of media being like, hey, everyone pay attention, it's time to vote, then they realize that it's time to tune in. And so I think it's really a difference of just what kind of participation you're getting. And then also I think that this race, frankly, was really encouraging to me in how the electorate was processing the two candidates, right? Because I think Farrell had a more traditional, he's a middle-aged white guy, he's very personable, he's been practicing how to, appeal to an audience, do well in interviews like this. Whereas Mannion, as a first-time candidate, was a little bit stiffer, didn't have as much of a, skill in terms of presentation, but is clearly qualified. You talk to her for any period of time and you understand that she has a much better grasp on the details of policy and frankly just the inner workings of the office that she's been in, which makes sense because she's been doing it for 20-some years. And so I think that voters rewarding that issue area, expertise and experience over sort of the sizzle of a practiced politician is really encouraging.
Well, let's talk about what voters might not be doing, and that's change the way they vote. I'm going to shift to Proposition 1, and Will, I'll start with you here. I thought it was interesting. The stranger endorsed a no vote on the first question of this measure. Should we change our voting system? And voters election night narrowly actually agreed with that, 51-49%. They also agree that between the choices of approval voting versus ranked choice voting, ranked choice would be the better idea. So if that no holds for question 1, but then voters also support option 1B for ranked choice voting, I'm confused already, but where does that lead us? What do you think?
Sure. I'll explain, because this was a debate we had in our newsroom for weeks, because it's frankly just a very complicated question. And it really just boiled down to the fact that in most localities that implement ranked choice voting, the main benefit you get is that you combine the primary and the general election. So voters only have to vote in one election, which is helpful, and it gives candidates a longer runway to make their arguments to voters and frankly get more attention aside from the super plugged in primary voters who show up and are following this from day one of the campaigns. And so I think our decision was largely based on the fact that because of state law, we don't have the ability to do that in this implementation, but we still wanted to have a strong signal to policymakers at the county level and in Olympia that people do want ranked choice voting. We would just like the flexibility of getting all the benefits at once.
Got it. I know the state's working on some issues there. King County's working on this one too. Naomi, some thoughts on this one. This proposition was definitely challenging to understand. The Times also endorsed a no vote on question 1 and said pick neither one on 1A and 1B. And I should point out that ranked choice got demolished in other jurisdictions. We're thinking about this in our state. Clark County and San Juan County said no with strong majorities there. What do you think happens next with this idea of changing the way we vote potentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because I was super confused just reading the ballot language. It was, and I work at a newspaper. I'm a native English speaker, and I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. And thankfully, reading these different resources was able to kind of make some sense out of what some of the core issues are. But I think looking at how we vote is really important, and I think that this is, in a lot of ways, a positive step forward as an approach, but not if people don't understand how it works and you're creating all this confusion and chaos in some ways. I think, if this is something that we want to explore or look at, it has to be done in a much more streamlined, clear, way that the voters can understand.
Yeah, just about the only place where approval voting and ranked choice voting were on the ballot, right, which I think made it very difficult for people. It is time to wrap up, and Naomi, let me start with you here. Some thoughts about turnout for this election. I called King County Elections to talk about this. They're telling me it'll wind up close to 65%, which is lower than the 72% they thought we might have at least a couple of weeks ago, and definitely lower than the 76% turnout we had in 2018. Anything you make of that, where people turned off, not as many people wanted to show up? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's really surprising to hear that because, looking at what happened yesterday at Lumen Field, people lining up.
A lot of people, yeah.
For hours to try to vote provisionally or vote for the first time. You saw full ballot boxes. I mean, obviously that's not not quantitative information,
Sure.
But I do think it's telling. I think I'm surprised if that's the outcome. But one of the things that I think is important as a takeaway, perhaps, from this election is the vote of young people, of Gen Z. I think we're going to see a lot of stories about that, and you're seeing an overwhelming favor towards Democrats from that generation, and you're seeing a first Gen Z person elected to Congress. So I think that's going to be a story we're going to be talking about for a long time, and it might be the sleeping giant that people haven't really been paying enough attention to.
Interesting points there all. Thank you. Will, any thoughts about voter turnout? Just wrapping up here.
Oh, I just think it's going to be interesting to see, once we can really dive into the details of that data, where the drop-off happened, right? Because I think something I've been curious about for the last couple of election cycles here is, as sort of a shibboleth among the Republican Party nationally becomes, that they don't trust our election systems.
Yes.
That's going to have some sort of trickle-down effect in discouraging turnout. And I think that's, frankly, a very concerning trend, because if people start, if there are no wins, right, for those candidates, then it's sort of a self-feeding narrative, and you get an increasingly larger and larger portion of the electorate that just doesn't have a relationship to the system, and that's a problem.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about these problems, I know, over the next several months and years, so I appreciate all this back and forth. Will and Naomi, thank you very much, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the midterm elections? One person writes, "The most important Seattle area local election this year is the race to replace King County Prosecutor Dan Satterberg. The position has broad discretion to shape the criminal legal system for the county's more than 2.2 million residents." Another says, "The way Washington State handles voting should be a model for the country. There are no polling sites, no place for voter intimidation, mail-in only, unless you want to register and vote on the same day." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next time, a conversation with the head of King County's Regional Homelessness Authority. Mark Dones has been on the job for more than a year. Are we closer to solving the region's homelessness crisis? We check in on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.